Hi, so we're going to deploy Azure Network Security Group, that's the NSG, for the web server NIC, which is the network interface card, and for the subnet. So let's see how to do that. So before we go on to the Azure portal, let's take a look at this diagram or this illustration that is done on, I did on Packet Tracer, trying to show what we want to do. So we are going to create a virtual network which will have an IP address range of 10.0.0.0/16, and then we're going to within it have a subnet called subnet 1, which is 10.0.0.0/24, and within it we're going to create the web server, and the web server would have a network interface card, and the web server will be connected to the internet as we are going to install an Apache web service into the web server and deploy a website onto the server, and we'll be able to access it through our clients. So what we want to prove is that the network interface card would have its network security group, which would deny or permit access to the web server at the network interface card level, and we're also going to have the subnet 1 will be given a network security group, which would also permit or deny access to the web server. So we're going to see how this network interface card network security group relates with that of the subnet 1. So let's go to the Azure portal and let's deploy our configuration. So we're back on Azure portal, and remember we need to create our virtual machine. So let's go to virtual machines, and we're going to click on create virtual machine, and we're going to create a resource group for our virtual machine, and we'll call that RG-Lab19. Okay, and the virtual machine name, we're just going to call it web server 01, just like we have in our illustration. That's here, web server 01. So that's the same thing we'll have here, web server 01. And then our region is fine, West Europe. Availability options, we do not need any availability zone, so it's zone redundant. Then we're going to have the image, which is going to be the Ubuntu with the Linux operating system. Then the size is fine, B1S. Then we're going to authenticate with password, and we'll get our username and password. So I'm going to use this Azure admin, paste, and the password. And public inbound ports, we are going to allow SSH so that we can have access to the machine. So click next, next. So let's create the virtual network, which is what we would have here, the VNet. So we're going to create new, and we're going to call it exactly what we have here, VNet. But instead, I'm going to call it VNet Lab. So let me write that, type that out, VNet and Lab 19. And we can see the address range, which is 10.0.0.0/16, and we can see where we will create our first subnet. So we'll call it subnet 1, and we can see it's 10.0.0.0/24, which is exactly what we have here. So the subnet within the virtual network. And once we are done, we'll click OK. And now we can see our VNet and our subnet 1. And the public IP, let's just make that PIP, that's public IP, which is fine. And NIC, network security group. So we're going to set our network security group for our NIC, which is the network interface card. So we are going to click on advanced, and we're going to create the network security group for our NIC. So create new, and we're going to call it NSG, which is network security group. Then for NIC, so NIC lab 19. And once we're done, we'll press OK, click OK, and that's fine. So we'll click next, next. And here we just want to deploy custom data to create our Apache web server. So we're going to use this, which would create a simple HTML page that will say this is my web server virtual machine. So we'll copy that, copy, and we're going to use the cloud init script. That's what we're deploying, and we'll press next, next to review, and then we will click create next. So we'll give it time to deploy our virtual machine, and now it says your deployment is complete. Go to resource, and now we can see our web server 01 is currently running with in the resource group RG Lab 19. Operating system is the Linux. We have our public IP address and the size standard B1S. So let's go to the resource group of the RG Lab 19, and let's see what it's created here. So here we have the NSG for the NIC. We also have the virtual network. We have our web server. We have our web server public IP, and we have the network interface card and the hard disk for the server. So next we need to consider creating our network security group for our subnet 1. But before we do that, let's play around with the network security group for our NIC, and let's see how that permits and denies us access to the web server. So we're back here. Let's go back to the virtual machine we created and web server 01, and let's check networking. And now we can see that we have our SSH permission, says allow. So let's just add the HTTP so that we can view the website in the server. So add inbound port rule, and I'm going to click the service. I want HTTP, so it sets everything for me, and priority is fine, and I'm going to name this allow HTTP inbound, and I'll just copy that for description, add. So just click connect, and let's copy this SSH, which says run the example command below to connect to your VM. So we're going to click on this to copy, and well, let's go back to networking just to be sure that we've deployed the allow permit rule. That's allow HTTP inbound, and we can see it's working. So before we test the SSH, let's see the public IP. Let's use it to access the website, and now we can see it's working. The Apache service, it says this is my web server virtual machine. So let's go through Cloud Shell to see if we can access the SSH inbound permit. So it's connecting, and now we're in the bash terminal. And now we have it pasted. I'm going to go and take this off because we're using username and password. So I'm going to press enter, and it says, are you sure you want to continue? I'll say yes, and it asks for the password, and I'm just going to use the password, paste, and enter. And now we can see we are connected to the web server. So let me just ping Google and count of 3, google.com, and we can see that it's sending and receiving, so it's working, and it means our SSH and HTTP permission rules have been applied and they're working, so we can have access to our virtual machine. So what we just did was we set the NIC network security group rules, and we told it to allow SSH and HTTP access from the client. So we tested that by viewing the web page and also having SSH access to the web server. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take off the rules, that's the permissions, and we're going to see that we won't be able to have access to the web server to view the website using HTTP, and also to have access through SSH. So let's do that. So I'm going to come back to the web server, but before then, let me just exit from the Cloud Shell. So I'm back to the web server, and let me go back to networking, and I'm going to remove this too. So I'll click on this and say delete, and yes, I want to delete the allow SSH, yes, and I also go ahead to delete the HTTP rule, yes. So let me try and connect back, and I'm going to copy this again and go back to Cloud Shell, and I'm going to paste that and take this off because we're not using my private key, we're using username and password, and I'll press enter, and now we can see that we can't have access anymore to SSH because it's timed out, as we can see, and that's because we have removed our SSH permit rule from here. And also, if we try to view the website, let's go to overview and copy this and command paste. We will see that we can't have access anymore to the website. So let's just go back and put them back. So add again, and we'll just use this custom, and first HTTP and add, and let me also add the other one, the SSH, and now we can see the HTTP inbound, and we can also see SSH inbound. So let me just confirm that. Go back to this. Let me first exit and reconnect again, and now I'm going to deploy that, and we can see it's back. So it asks for the password, copy, paste, and see, we're back now to access the web server, and we can also access the website. Copy, come back and paste, and now we can see this is my web server virtual machine. So we have seen now that the network interface card has its network security groups deployed, and it permits HTTP access and SSH access. And when we took that out, we couldn't have access to HTTP and through SSH anymore until we put it back. So that's what we can do. We can set the network security group on the NIC to determine that. But we can also set that on the subnet, which we are going to do next, and along with the NIC. And we'll see that once we switch on the network security group on the subnet, as long as we do not permit HTTP and SSH, it will deny access even to the NIC. So even if you set the SSH and HTTP on the NIC, it wouldn't mean anything because the subnet would stop the access to the server. And let's see how it will play out. We need to type out the network security groups, and we need to create a new one. This is what the one we have for the network interface card. So click on create, and we'll use the same resource group, lab 19. The name of the network security group, we're going to call that NSG, and lab 19. West Europe, fine. Review and create, and now create. That's done. So we'll go to resource, and we can see the inbound security rule and the outbound for the network security group for the subnet. So we're going to attach these network security group rules to the subnet one. So how do we do that? We have to go to the virtual network, just like we have here, the virtual network, then we'll go to the subnet, and then we'll now activate the network security group and attach it to subnet 1. So let's go to virtual network. So we'll type virtual networks, and we can see our virtual network, lab 19, and we'll click on it, and then let's access the subnet inside the virtual network. And now we can see the subnet 1. We can see it here with no security group attached yet. So we're going to click on that, and we'll go down to where we have network security group. So to have the options of the one we deployed on the network interface card, and we also have that which we just created. So we'll click on this one we just created for the subnet and save. And once that's done, we'll go back to view our virtual machine. So we'll look for virtual machines, and that's the web server 01. And let's go to networking, and now we can see that we have two network security groups assigned. We have the network security group for the subnet 1 and the network security group for the network interface card. And we can see the difference is that the network interface card has HTTP allow and SSH allow rules already deployed, as we can see, allow. But the subnet doesn't have the HTTP and SSH allow rules deployed. So it's going to deny HTTP and SSH because of this deny all inbound rule, which is at the end, deny. So let's take a look and see. Remember we said it's going inwards. So once the client tries to access, it will first go through the virtual network, and since there is no rule, it will move to the subnet 1 level, and that's what we just attached now to the subnet 1. So right now, subnet 1 would prevent access to HTTP and SSH because HTTP and SSH allow rules have not been assigned to it, though the NIC, network security group, has HTTP and SSH access assigned to it. It wouldn't still pass through the subnet layer. Let's just test that. So I'm going to go back, and let me close this and open again, and I'm going to run the same SSH, and we can see it's not giving us access to put in our password. Initially we could do that, so let's go back and also test the IP address of the virtual machine, that's the web server, and I'm coming here to paste, and we can see it's still loading. It won't have access anymore. Let me close that, and let me also close the Cloud Shell. But let me come back to where we have the network security group for the subnet 1, and I'm now going to add the inbound rules. So I'm going to add that of HTTP, add, and I'm going to also allow SSH, and we'll just copy that and add. And now we have the SSH and the HTTP currently deployed. So let's go back networking, and we can see SSH inbound and HTTP currently deployed on the subnet. So we can see there is a allow rule,
So since we have allow rule on the subnet, it means it will allow the HTTP and SSH access, and it will come down to the DIC card, and it also has the network security group assigned, the HTTP and SSH allow also assigned, and then it will now get to the virtual machine. So let's try again to see if we can have access to the web server. So I'm going to paste Django, and now we can see it's working. This is my web server, and let's go back to the Cloud Shell to see if we can have access through SSH. And I'm going to SSH, and we can see we now have access. So we have been able to successfully create the virtual machine, and we were able to deploy network security groups for the network interface card, and we also did that for the subnet world, and we showed how the network security groups on both the network interface card and the subnet affects the permit or deny access to the virtual machine.